I think one of the remarkable things about reading The Lord of the Rings is you go into this world which is, fairy tale. It's dragons and it's trolls and it's hobbits and it's elves. And it's amazing how authentic, genuinely authentic it feels, that you start to believe that it could possibly be history, that somehow Tolkien found some lost parchment and some secret parchment that we don't know about, that he really took all this from a true historical events. It has that degree of believability about it. I guess the way that we tried to hint at the depth, which is all that the film can really do, was partly in our design process. While we were working on the screenplay, we were able to start a team of people designing, because the great thing about Tolkien is that all the descriptions of what you need to build are in the book. You don't actually have to wait for the script to finish, unlike you would on a normal movie. I didn't want movie design. I didn't want fantasy movie Hollywood sort of style of design. I wanted something that felt authentic. I gave a little speech to the design crew very early on, where, and this is a little bit weird, but it was the only way I could really express myself. I said, look, we've been given the job of making The Lord of the Rings, but I want to, from this point on, I want to think that The Lord of the Rings is real, that it was actually history, that these events happened. And more than that, I want us to imagine that we've been lucky enough to be able to go on location and shoot our movie where the real events happened. Those characters did exist and they wore costumes, and I want the costumes to be totally accurate to what the real people wore. Hobbiton still exists. It's overgrown with weeds and it's been run down and neglected for the last 300 or 400 years, but we're going to go back in there and clean it up. We're the luckiest film crew in the world. We were able to shoot in the real locations that these real events actually took place in, and that was effectively my speech, to try to get everybody's head into what I actually sort of wanted in terms of a feeling of reality. You basically start thinking about what the places and the characters look like, and you realize that there's 40 years of artwork that people have done. And out of all the illustrations, all the artwork that's been done in calendars and books and, album covers and all sorts of things, the work of Alan Lee and John Howe impressed us the most. We had their artwork literally pinned on the wall of our office for 12 to 14 months while we were working on the screenplay. But I also thought it would be wonderful if we actually had these guys involved in the film as conceptual artists, because we had, by this stage, totally locked into their artwork. And I remember it was incredibly difficult to find Alan Lee, who's a fairly reclusive chap, and nobody really had a phone number for him. So we eventually tracked him down to a small village near Dartmoor in England. We put together a package and we FedExed us to this address, and we were tracking the FedEx. But we were literally tracking the van moment by moment. Jan, our assistant, was on the phone and she was saying, right, the van's about 50 miles from the village. And then she'd phone back, yes, it's arrived in the village, it's just looking for a street. And then we got a call back from FedEx saying, yes, so it's been delivered. And we knew at that exact moment that Alan had signed for this thing at his front door and he'd got it.
He sent over a copy of Heavenly Creatures, which I'd heard of, which hadn't seen, and enjoyed very much, with a letter telling me what he was up to, and asking if I'd like to get involved.
We thought, oh well, he'll probably get in touch in a day or two. Okay, well at least it's there. We'll just wait and see. And about 3.5 hours later, Alan phoned up. He got our phone number. He phoned up, and 3.5 hours he'd sat down. He'd watched Heavenly Creatures all the way through. He'd watched Forgotten Silver all the way through, and then he picked up the phone and spoke to me.
I didn't really need to think about it. Actually, I just sort of said, yes, I'll come out.
And John Howe was similar. We tracked down John Howe, who lives in Switzerland. I spoke to John on the phone, and I was just nervous on these phone calls. I was just like a kid.
It was about 2 or 3 in the morning, because somebody in New Zealand hadn't really thought about what time it was in where we lived in Switzerland. And there was Peter and Fran on the phone, making a very, very sincere sales pitch for the project. And it was really a question of waiting for them to finish so I could say yes.
And then in the space of probably within 2 or 3 weeks, Alan and John were flying to New Zealand, and they actually met each other for the first time. These are 2 renowned Tolkien artists that had never met each other before. They met each other on the plane flying to New Zealand.
It started off very much on an illustrator's level, where it was nothing but pencils and paper, meetings, ideas, sketches.
And we joined in with Weta's team of designers as well, who'd already been working on the project.
A vital person in the design process was Richard Taylor, who's a New Zealander, and Richard's worked on almost every film that I've made, certainly since Meet the Feebles. And Richard has the most wonderful team of designers who work with him at Weta. And, you know, as Alan Lee and John Howe were working on their conceptual design, so too were Richard and his team.
Initially, we had Alan Lee and John Howe working in our facility as well. Because they were here, we were able to utilise their immense knowledge of the world of Middle-earth and lift our young New Zealand designers to a level that was capable of accomplishing the massive task ahead.
I wanted Grant Major to design the film, and Grant had worked with me on Heavenly Creatures and The Frighteners.
New Zealand has never done a project on this sort of scale before. I'd never done a project on this scale before. So we were sort of breaking new territory a lot with the way we planned these things and keeping a large amount of people motivated and able to meet deadlines and keep up a standard of work through a very, very long period of time.
I wanted Dan Henner to be our art director, who'd done The Frighteners. You know, very important that those guys are part of the New Zealand film industry. They know how to get that stuff made and built here in New Zealand. The design process was a lot of fun. I would simply go and walk around and talk to them and give them thoughts, and you just narrow things down.
Peter will come in and we'll put a whole bunch of drawings up on the wall, a couple hundred drawings that we've been doing over the past few days.
We'd each have 2 or 3 different takes on any particular environment.
I sort of tend to like, I relate quite well to that as a silhouette shape. I mean, do you know, I think it has a sort of elegance to it.
We start doing drawings, and we get a little way with the drawings, and then, you know, after based on the feedback that Pete gives us, we start going into sculptures.
It was like being in a toy shop, really, and just being able to say, oh, I want one of those and one of those, and let's have 3 of those, and, you know, and being able to sort of work all these designs up.
Occasionally you would do a single drawing and Pete would go, that's it, love it, that's great, follow that line. Other times we would put up, in the case of the Urukai, a couple of hundred drawings before we got anywhere near what Pete was actually wanting.
You know, Peter's got a very good eye. You know, he knows what he's asked for, and when you've got to give him solid designs.
He would always find some positive aspect to everything that was done, but he would also be able to make you feel you weren't quite there yet. And you'd go away thinking to yourself, I've got to get this right. And it was really stimulating, really, really stimulating. And many, many times he pushed Alan and I much, much farther than we would have normally gone on our own in a design process.
We tried to give all the different cultures a very distinctive design. We wanted the dwarvish culture to be very, very distinctly different from, the Gondorian or the Elvish.
Everything about the way that character's dressed, the way they move, the colours that they wear, the shapes that are on their clothing, on their weaponry, on their armour. We wanted to make it look like you could look at a piece of architecture and tell if it was dwarven or elven immediately just by looking at it. If you looked at a weapon and then you looked at the architecture, you could tell which cultures were the same and which were different. So that meant establishing iconic designs. It's graphic design really at its basic level. Dwarves at a basic level, their shapes are square, they're rigid, they're sturdy, very much like the character of the dwarves. The elven stuff, very lyrical, very beautiful, very sinuous, very elegant. So that kind of thought went into it, and into establishing very clear and identifiable graphic styles for all the different races that would carry through all their design influences.
We were also trying to hint at this whole notion of art history. Much of Middle-earth was actually constructed by the Numenorians. So the bones of the architecture of Middle-earth were built by people who are no longer there. But some hint of this has to come through.
The idea of layers of civilization going back over thousands of years, which it's a very hard thing to do in a film or to achieve on a film set. But just by, laying much more design into the development of every part of the film, whether it's props or costumes or armour or buildings, than we'd ever actually really see on film. But its presence would be felt in some sort of strange way.
When I first came onto the film, began the same day as Alan Lee and John Howe. I spent the time myself designing from an architectural point of view from the illustrations that John and Alan had done. Some of these were initially made into architectural models.
I think we have to be very careful. We have to get rid of some of these little thin, tendrily ones.
As Peter agreed with various stages of the design, we called it a lock-off, a PJ lock-off. He would say, yes, okay, proceed. And we would proceed to the next step. We had a little star-shaped stamp made which had PJ approved on, because these approvals were very, very critical to us. We really weren't able to move on until he had seen and agreed to what we were doing. At about that time, we were having a series of meetings. We were pigeonholing things about what would become sets, what would become part set, part model, and then what would become part set, part model, and part computer graphic extensions. A lot of it was strategic design for how we were going to get to the point where we could start rolling the cameras, and start filming sets.
It's a pretty magical vista around here. There's no doubt.
It's nice having its own little valley in a way.
Yeah. I think we should go and relocate into a couple of other.
I remember our first trip to the Hobbiton location, or the potential location at that point, and there was this great moment occurred when Alan Lee and John Howe pulled out their sketch pads. They always went everywhere with pencils and paper.
You could sit in that landscape and see Hobbiton, almost as if you could do an overlay in front of your eyes. And Alan and I sat down on the hill above Bag End and started to draw, because there was the perfect landscape for Hobbiton.
So we were actually drawing the landscape, but putting the hobbit holes and the gardens and the fields and everything.
They were transforming the landscape on paper, and I just thought this is a great moment. And I remember we had a video camera there, so I actually grabbed the video camera because I thought this has got to be on the DVD, and I grabbed the video camera and I actually filmed myself. I filmed some stuff of them, in this moment where they were sketching.
Yep. Let me just get a close up in here, and then I'll let you get this still.
And the final look of the finished set, I don't know, a year later or whatever, was quite close to those original sketches.
The style of Hobbiton was first and foremost to be homely and familiar. So it has a kind of an Englishness to it that I think Tolkien would have liked us to use.
We talked to Peter and he said, why don't Hobbiton? We want Hobbiton to look beautiful. It's got to have long grass. It's got to look as though the grass has been there forever. It's got to have fruit trees with fruit on them. It's got to have hedges with leaves on them. It's a big place. How much lead-in time do you think you need to make it look as though it's always been there? We said, well, a year would be good. Okay, yeah, I think we could do a year, and so we started planning from a very early age with Hobbiton that we would begin construction a year out from filming.
Okay, so today we're going to Hobbiton, and sort of briefly, actually, Peter, this is the first time Peter is having a look at our work. Since we found the location, we've conceptualised it with Peter's involvement back in Wellington. We've had builders up here, landscapers, and the army in here to build roads, and a huge amount of effort and time and money being spent on it without Peter actually having been here to vet it. We've been reporting back to him with as much as we can with photographs and videos and kind of verbal questions and what have you. But this is the first day Peter's actually going to see it, and it's going to be great because he's either going to like it or he's not.
Yeah, it's good. I mean, we just need to get a lot of bushes and sort of make it more wild and woolly and sort of overgrown. But are they a few little bushes that are going down there?
They're doing gardens.
Right.
But I've told them just to keep putting bushes in until Christmas.
Yeah.
It's all around the chimneys, all around this stone wall.
Yeah.
Along the fence lines and things ought to be scrubbed.
The fence lines, there should be stuff all around the fence lines, yeah, you don't want those to be too clean.
And as part of the sort of general process of building it, we built a model of it in our art department computer.
Parallel to this, we built a huge architectural model. It would have been, 4 or 5 metres square. This would have been about a year and a half out from filming.
Once we'd found the location and worked out what we required there, we had to shift 5,000 cubic metres of earth, we had to drain a swamp, fill it in, make the party field, we had to build a big oak tree above Bag End, and then of course we had to build some sort of little hillocks to have hobbit holes.
And we cut into our little hillocks the fronts of where the hobbit holes were going to be. We sowed grass over the hills. We planted little market gardens and we planted trees.
Another little hobbit hole. Feel like knocking on the door and popping in for a cup of tea. Second breakfast, perhaps.
Once all these things had been planted, it was really a matter of keeping it all going, letting nature take its course over the year. It was a very long and organic process, designing and building it, but I'd like to think that the Hobbiton needed that scale of detail to work well.
John and I, obviously, we each had quite a backlog of work that we'd done with these stories, so there were certain images that Peter had really liked.
A good example is the front hall of Bag End, because Peter had in mind an image that I'd done for a map of the Hobbit several years before.
That was just the most brilliant image of what the inside of the Bag End front hall might be like. And I basically just said, look, this is what I want in the movie. I've been looking at this picture for like 2 years now, wondering what the rest of Bag End is like. So can you please draw me the rest of Bag End? And he did it, and that was a great thrill of saying, taking this hallway and then having the actual artist, John, extend it and do all the other rooms.
Suggestion of something behind. I don't think you'd need to do anything detailed. Wells is a scenic artist, and he's doing the view from Strider's room at the Prancing Pony, and that's the view from the room. Just talking about Paul's lovely painting of the broad view of Bree.
Bree was a lot simpler to design than many of the other ones because it was relying a lot more on vernacular English period architecture. We built most of Bree as a set piece, so it only exists in one instance as a computer-generated wide shot. So we built it in what used to be an old Navy base here in Wellington in Port Dorset, and used one or two existing streets on which to build the set.
We worked on making everything quite tall, quite thin, slightly off plumb as it were, so the buildings all felt as though they were leaning in over you. And then the Prancing Pony itself, that whole scale issue once again came into play, where all the tables and chairs were big, all the people were huge, and our little guys were sort of slightly vulnerable, and so everything, there was a darkness, a slightly gothic edge to Bree.
The Weathertop Hill was actually quite difficult to find that location. It's described as being a hill like a cone, and the one that we found for the movie actually doesn't quite fit that description, but it's more interesting, and we just thought that this was a wonderful weathertop. We just had to put ruins on the top of the hill.
It's the possible western Weathertop Hollow, and there's the escape vehicle cast on the muddy road. Oh, it's going to be a long walk.
So the ruins and the wide shots are just put in with a computer, but when the hobbits are actually within that circle of ruins, they are in a studio set.
Basically, it's a ruined tower that once held one of the Palantirs. We've built, really, from the Tolkien's basic description of the ruins of a circular tower. We've added these statues, which they're not complete yet. They're going to be more broken down. I've never done this before. And the figures were sculpted by Brigitte, who's one of our very talented sculptors. But as a sculptor, she's probably not the person to be actually attacking them and aging them down. I guess they just sort of represent some element of the age of of this place, but they're also kind of like a brooding presence, a kind of foreboding of what's about to happen. Spectators, really, of the events that can unfold in this arena.
Isengard comes directly from an illustration of Alan's, which Peter loved so much he wanted exactly the same. But Alan had only drawn the bottom portion.
I always looked at that painting wondering what the rest of the tower was like. You know, I just wondered how high is it and what's the top of it like, and because it was just such a brilliant painting. And so the day finally arrived, I could say to Alan, can you paint me the rest of the tower, please? Can you show me what the rest of it is like?
It is described as being black by Tolkien, so we chose obsidian volcanic glass as the element that had been made from. So we wanted to give it a sharp, blade-like, hard, aggressive quality.
We built the structure out of a normal framework and polystyrene, and then we coated it with a hard coat, black hard coat, and then a clear hard coat. So we built up the sort of layers of lacquer, virtually, to give it a depth, so at the pointy edges you could see through it. And then we waxed it, which gave it even more sort of texture to the depth.
There was a lot of different elements in that design. You know, everything feels like it belongs in that one place. And it was another really satisfactory set to work on. It wasn't a place I particularly wanted to spend a night, but it would be a nice place for a very sophisticated cocktail party. Yeah, at the moment I'm just trying to draw this as a landscape, just exactly as I would if I were, sitting in a wood drawing something for pleasure, and then kind of adding in the various architectural elements that I'm kind of making up as I go along. Really, I'm just trying to get a feeling of the place as it is and its potential as a place for the elves.
How do you define a culture which could be eternal, that could be forever perfecting itself? You have to search for some form of simplicity which can allow you to stop evolving and find that perfect line.
It's the use of natural forms. It's the use of flowing, graceful lines. There are kind of elements of Art Nouveau and Celtic design, but it is quite an intuitive, enigmatic thing. It's not something that's easy to kind of pin down. With Rivendell, I think I was trying to create a place that I'd want to retire in. It's just this ideal environment in a beautiful lost valley, and the whole thing would feel slightly kind of melancholic and quiet, and also you get the sense that it was a centre of learning, that there'd been libraries and statues, works of art.
The Rivendell exterior sets were built in a small regional park called Kaitoke, just north of Wellington.
It's a sort of peculiar set in that it's inside out, so the trees grow inside the buildings are built around the trees. It's very much as Lothlorien was, at one with nature, at one with its sort of foliage.
And we made a model of the woods and placed every tree, and then just made small scale versions of the buildings, and just worked out a way that we could place the buildings in a way that wouldn't damage any trees, and that the buildings would have kind of openings which allowed for the trees to grow, so that you'd feel that the trees had grown up around these buildings which have been there for 1,000 years or so. Yeah, it was just one of those places that I personally wanted to spend a lot of time. I even thought about sleeping overnight in Frodo's bed, but I don't think the props people would have been quite happy about that. The next major thing was the interiors of Elrond's chamber and the council chamber, which was built in the studio. And again, that was a very lovely set.
The dressing of Elrond's house reflects Elrond having this world-renowned library in his house. it also forms in part a museum of all these significant events, and in particular the fall of Barad-dûr for the first time, and the loss of the ring. So this is manifested in a lot of sort of prop detailing, but most of all in Narsal, the broken sword is present as a centerpiece in this museum, and also along the walls are a series of paintings or frescoes, one or two of them done by Alan Lee.
They basically were the history of the elves, and they're the most beautiful, stunning pieces of artwork. The boats that they arrived in, the making of elven rings. The centerpiece is Sauron smashing Narsal, and then there's various other pieces of elven history on either side.
The Mines of Moria was probably the most studio-based out of everything we had done to date. We used miles and miles and miles of rock work. There's various layers of occupation, you could say, and there's this natural layer of rock. There's this dwarven layer. There's this orcish layer that we see more and more of as we go through. There's this destruction layer where battles have happened, battles have been lost. You know, the closer we get to where the Balrog lives, the more smashed up it is.
The dwarvish architecture we decided was going to be entirely geometric, that there wouldn't be any curves or any rounded forms, any round arches, so that it would all feel very kind of crystalline. And that design ethic was kind of followed through into the armour and the weapons and every aspect of the dwarves, really. I think they're big people at heart. They were, had a grand civilization, and they, it just felt right that they would build enormously impressive structures.
Much of it's manifested through model work. As soon as we go mega wide, obviously that's way bigger than what we could afford to build and our studios could accommodate. So, the CG and model work plays a large part in the immensity of the Mines of Moria.
I had drawn the Dwarf chamber before with arches and rounded columns, but thinking in a little bit more detail about ways of distinguishing the dwarves from everyone else. I changed my mind about dwarven architecture after working on this film, and so the Dwarf chamber, which was entirely digitally created, except for a few kind of just the very bottom ends of the pillars, which were done as set pieces. That was all based on one drawing that I did, which incorporated the pillar designs and the sense of scale that you want to establish in a place like that.
In the screenplay that we wrote, it describes the Fellowship fleeing from the first appearance of the Balrog. The script says something like they run down some stairs and across the bridge of Khazad-dûm. And Alan Lee went away and drew the stairs. And what he brought back to me was kind of pretty mind-blowing. It was more than just what I was imagining a staircase to look like. It was this incredible cavern, an image of this cavern with this narrow staircase on the top of these huge viaduct-like kind of pillars.
In the course of drawing that, I thought, well, I'll just make a little break or two in that staircase, and then Peter really latched onto that.
I just looked at this hole in the stairs, and I started to sort of imagine other things happening around that hole. And that really was the seed of what ultimately became, one of the most extended sort of action set pieces in the entire movie. And the script still says to this day, the Fellowship run downstairs towards the bridge. That's all that it says.
Over the bridge! High!
Good morning, Paul.
Hello.
What are you working on?
Caris Galadon, the Lothlorien Woods, where the elves live. There's gonna be a little Frodo and crew somewhere in here. Camera will kind of pull back from them to reveal the city. Palace, rather.
Tolkien's descriptions of Lothlorien are amongst the most beautiful and enigmatic writings in his work. So it was really quite a big challenge trying to come up with something that would match those. I wanted Lothlorien to be, you know, obviously elvish, but to have a distinctly different feel. And the fact that it's built up in treetops is obviously going to be a huge part of that difference. We also wanted it to feel slightly more unworldly, otherworldly, and more mysterious, and probably a more kind of spiritual place, as though Lothlorien is the spiritual heart of the elven kingdoms on Middle-earth.
We needed to find a forest that had that beautiful, magical essence to it, but also had these huge trees, which of course we don't have huge trees quite like these in New Zealand, so we had to build some trees. And we did it up at Paradise with a beautiful moss-covered ground in the beech forest, and then we built 5 huge, like 16-foot diameter trees that went up 40 feet high into the air. Once they've made contact with the elves, you move on into Caris Galadon, this is where the melon trees are. So we essentially built the melon trees in the studio. And gave them great big root structures that the guys could have a little settlement under, their sort of pavilion. I think there was that essence that the elves were at one with nature, with the forest. You know, they were part of it, as opposed to being dominating it. They were working with it. You know, whereas we would have gone in with a chainsaw and cleared a place and built a house, they've done the opposite. They've gone in and worked with the trees and added staircases and put in flats that they could live on in perfect crotches of trees, things like that.
Galadriel's Glade was quite a nice little set. This was our first look at the actual Lothlorien trees, and was trying to kind of establish the look of the roots and everything. Then follow that through with the design of the plinth and the bowl and the vase, and it was very nice actually seeing that scene coming together. Galadriel has always been a hugely important character for me in the books, so to see Cate Blanchett standing in Galadriel's Glade was very, very nice, very exciting.
We're at the Silverlode Riverbank in Featherston, which is where Galadriel gives all our hobbits and the Fellowship we present as they leave Lothlorien. We built a bit of a malorn tree here, 6 metres high and about 6 metres in diameter, with roots that run out into the lake, so that we can pull up our boats into the roots. To build it, we did a timber frame, put chicken mesh and foil over that with hessian on it, then plastered the whole thing, then given it all a coat of paint in the rain. We've eventually ended up with a really interesting texture there that could look 1,000 years old.
From the moment we see the Argonaths, we are sort of on the outer reaches of what used to be the empire of the Númenóreans, as they were in the Second Age. Now the Argonaths were like 2 sentinels on the outside of one of the approaches to this huge empire.
We wanted to give the feeling that we were, we were entering the realm of this very, very ancient civilization, long past its prime. It's like kind of ancient Rome or Egypt or Mesopotamia.
It's almost as if you're digging things out of the ground rather than actually creating them.
The ruins themselves are based on the architecture of men, some of which we had seen before, for example on Weathertop. So we kept back a lot of our ruined pieces, knowing that we were going to need them later on in the filming. And we made a few new ones, like this gigantic face that was lying on its side.
The seeing seat itself at the top has got these eagle motifs, suggesting that because eagles have this acute vision, that's kind of connected with what Frodo's going to see. New Zealand doesn't have a lot of ancient stones and stuff around the landscape. Everything had to be introduced, and it's mainly made of polystyrene. But I think it, did the trick really. It just made you feel that you were in a very, very ancient land.
Are we going to have like sort of big pumpkins and sort of stuff, and where you have a little guy kind of who's just scored a good cheap bloody buy?
Propping for the film is an industry in itself. The film demanded a particular type of prop that you just don't get in the prop shops or antique shops. So we had to build up our own props department and build everything from scratch. We also had to do it because of scale. We were constantly needing to duplicate different props at different scales.
A huge amount of stuff had to be made, and it meant designing everything, the whole thing. Absolutely crazy. But I think this is one of the strengths of The Lord of the Rings, is because everything had to be designed. There were no shortcuts. There was no sort of going out and picking something off a shelf. Had to put a bit of thought into it.
We've lengthened that, put a bit more of a curve in it, and straightened the bowl, so you've got it down in this sort of position. The bowl is actually straight.
Looks good. Looks good.
Every pipe, every chair, every cup, saucer, glass, everything was designed specifically for the film, so we had to make it.
We did have to look for people with these sorts of skill bases within the community, people who can make the one ring. Those sorts of things were contracted out to craftspeople, silversmiths, art makers, saddlery makers.
We got a glass blower and we got some furniture makers and some wood carvers, a chap who could make clay pipes, coopers to make barrels and buckets, wheelwrights to make wheels for wagons. It starts off at the conceptual area, but it works right through down to the ground level guy who's applying the aging to a wooden bucket to make it look as though it's carried water for 300 years,
Yeah, just doing these little buttons that in two scales for this chest here. It's little babies, and getting them exactly the same.
And finding these sorts of people who are willing to work day and night for a year, 2 years, to make the amount of props we needed was huge.
As a props department, art department, we took responsibility for the ring. Had it made by an absolutely wonderful master silversmith, goldsmith, Jens Hansen. Something like 15 rings made of that sort of vaguely fell into the description that Peter had given and Tolkien had obviously written about. So Rick Porus, our co-producer, was there during one of these discussions one day about the ring. And
the next day we ended up shooting this little sequence where we all sort of play these different characters, and we needed a prop, so I pulled off my wedding ring.
And action. Frodo!
When we were done, I said, Pete, I actually think that, obviously I'm biased, but I really like the way my wedding ring looks.
And, everyone loves their wedding ring. But anyway, it had a sort of shape to it that just had a nuance that was slightly different from the others. And so we took that with us the next time we went to Jens Hansen to talk about the design of the ring. And
making some adjustments after that, they kind of rounded it off a bit, but sort of they used that as, I guess, a basic starting point for the one ring.
And action.
It's been a huge kind of collaborative process all the way through, and there hasn't been a great kind of division of your labour, and so you've had people who might have been brought on as painters who suddenly find themselves sculpting or kind of hammering stuff together. And so I've done, my share of kind of heaving props around and gardening, pushing wheelbarrows full of gravel.
The film was epic in every sense of the word. There was 3,000 people in the crew, 300 people in the art department.
Everyone was dedicated to what they were doing, even if they weren't great Tolkien fans before they started working on the picture. They took it on board, they lived with it, they became part of Middle-earth.
So much more went into making this movie than can ever appear in the movie itself.
That was the aim right from the beginning, to create a world that you felt had been in existence for hundreds of thousands of years.
Being able to think of it and see it as something that is real certainly made it real, And now it does exist, it does exist somewhere.